whistle, but I can't. Anybody want to whistle for me? Very good, very good, very good. If you would find your way back to your seats, we have handouts making their way around. And raise your hand if you don't have handouts yet. So we have a good idea of what section still needs handouts. We'll be making our way around. Rafi here, and somebody might want to help Rafi do some handing out. He might need some additional help getting those out. But we are delighted and excited to welcome to our platform this morning Dr. David Calhoun, who is Professor of Philosophy at Gonzaga University in Spokane, Washington. And I will say this about Dr. Calhoun. He has been a dear friend of this school and this Institute for Christian Apologetics, and dear friend of mine over the last couple of years. We have a lot of shared interest in various cultural things like film. And if you have a chance this afternoon, he's going to have some breakout sessions basically talking about the relationship between apologetics and movies. And so that is going to be incredible. I'm very excited to have the opportunity to hear some of those sessions again. And he's working on a lot of stuff. He's got a lot of important stuff in the works. But today he is going to be speaking to us on Blaise Pascal and the Pensée, what we can glean from apologetics there. And I just want you to give a warm round of applause to Dr. David Calhoun.
Good morning. There is a handout. I'm not exactly going to follow it, but it may be useful to you just with some notes and resources. I'm going to cover some of the stuff that's on the handout. I want to start with just thinking about the wager and its place in apologetics. People that are interested in apologetics often encounter the wager early in their experience. And even if you're not interested in apologetics, but you're subjected to apologetics, you often run into versions of Pascal's wager. And we all know, I'm assuming most of you are familiar with the basic idea of the wager. The idea is that the possible payoff of belief in God outweighs the risks associated with believing. And the idea is that a rational person will therefore choose to believe in God and live a Christian life. Now, the problem is, even though people run into this and they're exposed to the idea of the wager, I think often our sense is that, like many of the classical theistic arguments, like the ontological argument, for example, it often seems intriguing and attractive to people, even lay people, even people that don't have any technical knowledge about apologetics. But at the same time, often people feel like, wait, there's something fishy going on here. The wool's being pulled over my eyes. And certainly there is something to the idea of risking belief. But if we analyze the wager argument in isolation, it's very easy to very quickly come up with all kinds of objections. For example, why think the teachings of Christianity about eternal reward and eternal punishment are true? Obviously, the wager depends on this claim that in making a calculation about choosing to wager belief in God or not to wager belief in God, the wager structures this in terms of claims about what's going to happen to us after we die. Secondly, why think of Christianity as in simple opposition to all other religions or even no religion? If you've ever tried to use the wager in an apologetic context, almost the first objection that people make is, well, wait, why do I have to choose to believe in the Christian God and live a Christian life? Aren't there all kinds of God choices to make? Aren't there all kinds of religious traditions that I might pursue? And there are even, it's fair to say, there are even religious or theological objections that are raised against the wager. For example, that risking religious belief as a calculation to benefit yourself just seems impious. I don't know if you ever thought about that, but I'm trying to calculate what's best for me eternally. Do I believe in God in order to benefit myself, in order to escape punishment for myself, etc., etc.? Why would we ever think that God would reward calculating, mercenary believers anyway? I think a key problem is that the wager is only part of a larger apologetic project that Pascal is engaged in. And if we extract the wager from the context of this larger apologetic project, then we actually distort Pascal's purposes. And I think actually we end up undermining the value of the argument. The scattered notes that are gathered together as the Pensées, I'm not going to talk about this, but if you don't know the history, the Pensées, the thoughts in English, even though it's published as a book, for example, I happen to have the Oxford translation by Honor Levy here with me. It was not a finished product. Instead, at the time of Pascal's death, it was a series of notes. And, of course, Pascal didn't have digital tools available to him. In fact, he had very crude analog tools. If you know the story, the Pensées were notes scribbled on the equivalent of Post-its, and then he took a thread and needle and bundled groups of them together. And so at his death, when people started going through his effects, they found all of these bundles of stuff, bundles of notes, and tried to make sense of it. And when we look at the totality of the Pensées, what we find is a variety of apologetic approaches. This is not the finished final product that Pascal had in mind. By the way, he intended to title the book An Apology for the Christian Faith. So he knew about the idea of apologetics, and he was definitely focused on apologetics as the purpose of what we now call the Pensées. He used a variety of approaches in these notes, attention to miracles, examination of fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies, comparative religions, thinking about the relationship of Christianity to Judaism and to Islam and to some Eastern religions that he was at least minimally familiar with. I think if we pay attention to this larger context, what we find is that the wager is primarily a demonstration that belief in God is not unreasonable. And what that means is that further arguments for committing to the Christian faith are necessary for the wager to have its argumentative apologetic effect successfully. What's going on in Pascal's Pensées is a little bit different from what we might expect in an apologetic project. Apologetics normally focuses on reasons for historical or doctrinal claims of Christianity. Although, as our prior speaker noticed and reminded us of, there are multiple methods or approaches of apologetics. When we look at the wager, we see that a classical approach of trying to prove the truth of God's existence or the truth of certain doctrines of Christianity, like the historicity of the resurrection, that's not really what Pascal is doing. That's not the fish he is frying. Instead, what the wager shows us is that Pascal is trying to show that it's reasonable to believe in God and live a Christian life. And so if we take the wager as a kind of reference point, we can see that Pascal's approach is, and I have a list here, it's existentialist insofar as it addresses the meaning of Christianity for a human life, a vibrant, a full, a complete, happy human life. It's anthropological because he seeks to show how Christianity specifically addresses the human condition. And it's especially sensitive to the dynamics of conversion, given Pascal's own dramatic conversion experience in 1654. I want to this is something else. I mean, with Pascal, there are always so many rabbits we can chase. And I just want to mention this. If you don't know about Pascal's conversion experience, It's an amazing thing that shapes his biography. He was raised as a Christian. He was influenced and formed as a Christian. There was apparently a period where he lived a more worldly life, and yet after his father's death, he had a dramatic experience that lasted pretty much an entire night. And he has a record of it called the Memorial, and it was so significant to him that for the rest of his life, he kept a copy of the Memorial sewn into the lining of his jacket to remind him at all times, this is the change that God has made in my life. That might make it sound like Pascal's conversion experience is emotional, and there was an emotive element. There's a heart element, as he makes clear if we look at the text of the Pensées. But also, given Pascal's intellectual interests in logic and reasoning and probability, he's also very interested in the why and the mechanics and the dynamics of conversion. How does conversion take place? And how do I use some understanding, we might even call it the psychology of conversion. How does an understanding of the psychology of conversion equip us with tools to communicate the truth of the gospel to other people? I want to say a little bit more about this anthropological dimension of his apologetic. Pascal's approach focuses on the human condition as a clue about how we should live. He says in one of what I take to be one of the most strikingly clear passages of the Pensées, the true nature of man, his true good, true virtue, and true religion cannot be known separately. In a sense, he's telling us that a study of the human condition is going to point us to God if we conduct that study accurately, systematically, and carefully. So an anthropological apologetic is one that starts with the data of the human condition. What is it like to be a human being? What is it like to experience the world as a human being? And an anthropological apologetic then reflects on and teases out the implications and meanings of that. In Pascal's view, the human condition is one of mystery. Why are we here? What is our purpose? He says in one of the most beautiful passages of the Pensées that the human condition is like waking up on a desert island with unanswered questions about human existence, meaning, and purpose. And even though I hope in my talk to point you to and recommend you to read the Pensées for yourself if you haven't read it, and to think about what Pascal is doing and think about what resources there are available. I'm only going to quote a little bit, but this is one passage I want to read to you because I find it so striking and so modern. Remember I told you that his conversion was in 1654. He lived in the 1600s, and yet 400 years later, his words sound like a description of the modern condition. In fragment 229, he says, "On contemplating our blindness and wretchednesses, and on observing the whole of the silent universe, and humanity with no light, abandoned to itself, lost in this nook of the universe, not knowing who put us there, what we have come to achieve, what will become of us when we die, incapable of all knowledge, I become frightened, like someone taken in his sleep to a terrifying deserted island who wakes up with no knowledge of what has happened, nor means of escape." By the way, again, rabbit chase. If you're familiar with the TV series Lost, if you think about what Pascal is saying here, I think it would not be surprising to think that the producers of Lost were thinking about this passage when they first began to reflect on a scenario for a TV series. "At that point, I am astonished that we do not despair at so wretched a state. I see others around me whose nature is the same as mine, and I ask them if they are better informed than I am. They say they are not. Then those wretched lost people, having looked around and seen some agreeable enough objects, gave themselves to them and became attached to them. For my part, I have not been able to find such an attachment, and considering how much more probable it is that there is something more than I cannot see, I have sought to find whether this God has not left some mark of himself. Shades of Romans chapter 1, right? What traces has God left in the universe for those of us who are, to use Walker Percy's turn of this phrase, lost in the cosmos? Most people, as Pascal notes, respond to the mysteriousness of the human condition by distracting or diverting themselves with attractive objects to which they become addicted and attached. We are easily distracted by the fragile condition of our embodied existence because, as Pascal argues, reason, the human glory, is so unhinged by imagination. And so what we often do is, instead of facing up to the mysteriousness, the perplexity of human existence, we entertain ourselves. We fall into what Pascal calls diversion. And yet what Pascal notes, and again, this sounds to me like a condemnation of late 20th, early 21st century advanced technological culture. We find shiny things to distract our attention, and we don't pay attention to or address or explore the mystery of the human condition, and instead we submerge ourselves in our wretchedness and pretend as though we are not wretched. The result of this, according to Pascal, is that the unhinging of reason and lazy occupation of diversion fosters a skepticism that equates everything. Everything's equally good. Whatever. Never mind. Once we lose the true human good, all goods appear equally appealing. So again, as I've said, I think we see in Pascal's analysis and diagnosis an inevitable tendency towards skepticism and relativism of the sort that we are very familiar with in modern culture. The only true alternative to diversion is the quest of seeking to understand the human condition. And here Pascal notes an interesting paradox. On the one hand, facile praise of human beings makes too much of us and feeds our pride in ourselves, while pessimistic condemnation ignores the glory inherent in human beings. And then there's that third way. Diversion simply pretends that the mystery of human existence is not mysterious or perplexing. So notice what Pascal is saying here. There are three natural responses to the mysteriousness and perplexity of human existence, and all three are abject failures. In contrast, Pascal himself says, I can only approve those who search in anguish. This sounds like Kierkegaard, several centuries before Kierkegaard. The question we ask ourselves, according to Pascal, is what is the true place or proper level on which to put ourselves? Or really, to put the question bluntly and directly, who am I? Who am I? Who is the self that wakes up on this desert island, looks around and finds things that are alien and unfamiliar and mystifying? Pascal's answer to this question is in a passage where he identifies our nature as that of a thinking reed. As he says, it is not in space that I must look for my dignity, not in exploration of the world outside of myself, but in the organization of my thoughts. Through space, the universe grasps and engulfs me like a pinpoint. Through thought, I can grasp it. The reed dimension of this comment is an acknowledgement that we are part of or engulfed by the universe, physical organisms completely embedded in the cosmos. And of course, the image of the reed is fragile organisms embedded in the cosmos. But we are thinking reeds. We might even say, of course, Pascal would agree with the idea, we are spiritual reeds. We can grasp or understand the universe through the transcending power of reason. So strangely enough, we are alien objects in the cosmos because we are part of the cosmos, but we can transcend the cosmos in a way of understanding what the cosmos is, what meaning it has, and to address this question, who we are and what our purpose is. To say that we are thinking reads, if you know your early modern philosophy, you can see there's a clear allusion here to the early modern French philosopher Descartes, who lived at the same time as Pascal. Descartes' claim is that a human being is a thinking thing, a res cogitans, an indestructible immaterial mind that is causally associated with a physical body, right, in Descartes' famous metaphysical dualism. But in contrast to that, Pascal wants to point out, and he does argue, has a series of arguments against Descartes' dualism, which tends to think of reason as not only having the power to transcend physical nature, but being unaffected by physical nature. If you know your Descartes again, in the sixth meditation, Descartes offers an argument that that our body and mind are so causally intertwined with one another that it's as though they were one thing. But it's also the case that Descartes believes that the power of rationality isn't subject to the whims of the body, the passions of the body. A good part of the argumentation that Pascal offers in the Pensées is an exploration of the ways in which our rationality, as I've mentioned earlier, can be unhinged by our passions. One of his dramatic examples of this is a kind of example that would be familiar to anyone in New Orleans, in the South, who's ever studied in a room where a fly is buzzing around. Try to focus on Hegel, or try to focus on a biblical commentary with all around your head. It's going to be very different. Why? Because we are rational beings, but we are embodied beings as well. And this is an important point for Pascal that shows, again, if we're carefully looking at our own human condition, we see that we are characterized by disproportion, as he calls it. We are located between angels and beasts. We have angelic dimensions, an angelic aspect in our power to transcend physical nature, but we also are part of physical nature. Our attempts to play the angel inevitably lead to beastly self-promotion. And of course, our descents into diversion are a denial of our power of transcendence. Reflective humans tend either to overemphasize reason or the passions, either claiming that we are pure rational minds, a la Descartes, or emotive beasts, and by the way, I might say, a la contemporary materialistic atheists, right? So if you know about studies of human cognition, for example, that have been in vogue in biology and anthropology over the last 50 years or so, a significant part of that project is to make the argument that human beings, to use the Darwinist way of putting the equation, that we differ from animals in degree and not in kind. There's no qualitative difference between humans and animals. But Pascal, on this point, is a reliable traditionalist. He wants to argue that a thorough and honest anthropology must acknowledge both our angelic nature and our bestial nature. And as I might point out again, chasing a rabbit here, contemporary research on animal cognition actually, I think, supports Pascal on this. Animals are capable of many rich and wonderful things in their engagement with and experience of the world, but animals are not capable of transcending reflection on the world in the way that human beings are. That's a rabbit chase, which we can follow more if you'd like to, but I'm going to leave that at that. Given the duality of human condition, we have to have the right understanding of the relationship between reason and religion, neither to exclude reason nor to exalt it. In a dramatic hyperbole, Pascal says, there is nothing so consistent with reason as the denial of reason. Of course, Pascal, logician, probability theorist, isn't saying that we should deny reason altogether. He's instead saying that we must acknowledge the limits of reason, but avoid a relativistic or fideistic denial of reason altogether. If we submit everything to reason, our religion will contain nothing mysterious or supernatural. If we shock the principles of reason, our religion will be absurd and ridiculous. So we don't want the absurdity or ridiculousness of a fideism that says it's true because I believe it deeply and intensely, but nor do we want a religion that is so austerely and rationally and logically conceived that it doesn't understand the complexity of the human condition. This has implications for classical apologetics. Pascal is aware of the power that theistic arguments can have, but he's also very cautionary about the limitations of classical theistic arguments. Given human weaknesses, they're not dispositive, and even where effective, their power is temporary. He notes that when and I wonder if you've had this experience before where you spend an afternoon working carefully through the ontological argument and reading Plantinga and reading objections and going back to Anselm, and you think, I've got an insight there. I think I know how this is working. And then 2 hours later, 5 hours later, the next day, you think, I feel like I missed something. It just hasn't made a home in my heart. This is, as you can see, this is an application of Pascal's point of the human condition as involving wretchedness and disproportion. Certainly where rational and classical theistic arguments speak to our powers of rationality, argumentation, and logic. But we are also embodied, passional, emotive beings. And the classical theist, any apologetic has to take that into account. If we don't understand that the people that we engage in apologetics with are flesh and blood, embodied human beings, then we're often going to fail. I don't think Pascal's comments are meant to count as a fideistic rejection of natural theology. By the way, some people, here's another side rabbit we could chase. There are some people who take Pascal's comments about the heart has its reasons, which reason does not know, as evidence that Pascal is a fideist. I don't think he is, for the reasons I've been giving here. So what he's instead doing is defending the use of reason in apologetics, but he's also acknowledging that reason is limited by the kinds of beings that we are, or the use of reasoning, the effectiveness of reasoning is limited by the kinds of beings that we are. Okay, so now finally, after all of this, we come back to the wager. And recall, the objective of the wager is to help religious skeptics in particular. I think if we look at the context in the Pensées, he's thinking here. There was a period when I mentioned that he was involved in worldly activities. He hung out in gambling dens and played cards with friends. And in part, that's where he got the interest that he had in probability theory. And when he's thinking about the wager, he's not thinking about, well, he's thinking about a specific kind of person. I should put it positively. He's thinking about that skeptical kind of person who would say, religion? What possible meaning could religion have for me? The point of the wager is to help religious skeptics see that belief in God is minimally reasonable. Or even, let's put it negatively, it's not unreasonable. We can see that there might be good reasons for believing religious claims and engaging in and living a human life, a Christian life. As such, the wager does little more than clear away skeptical obstacles to religious belief. As I've said earlier, it doesn't give us Christianity. It doesn't bring us to Christianity. It simply points out that I can imagine conditions under which a belief in God and pursuit of a Christian life could be reasonable. while we're talking about the wager, I want to connect what I've said so far about passions and our dual nature to an important point that's going on in the wager. One objection that people often make is that Pascal seems to advocate, and you may have even heard this phrase used in connection with Pascal, that we fake it till we make it, because at the end of the wager passage of the Pensées, his imaginary interlocutor, he's speaking with someone, what do I have to do? Can't I avoid making the wager? No. If you don't wager, you've still wagered. You've wagered no, and so forth. He reaches the end, and the person says, okay, even if I follow your argument, what about the fact that I don't find myself, I might intellectually see, okay, I can imagine a situation, a scenario in which belief in God and pursuit of Christian life would be reasonable, but I don't feel it in any way deep in my personality. Do you mean I just have to pretend to believe? And Pascal does say, well, if you find yourself in that position where you see the plausibility of Christianity, and yet at the same time you don't feel it, what you should do is place yourself in situations where you're in contact with other people that have been in the past in the situation that you find yourself in at present. Put yourself around believers, because as you engage in the activities of believers, you're going to find yourself becoming accustomed to the practices and disciplines of the Christian life, and they'll have then, as time develops, you'll begin to inhabit those practices internally, and they'll have a logic, and they'll make a sense that they wouldn't make from a person looking at them from outside. But Pascal's point is not so much fake it till you make it as it is to really highlight for us that often in the project of apologetics, the real task isn't to offer an argument or another argument or a key piece of evidence. It is to clear away prejudicial passions that impede our understanding of what is reasonable. And this is a really strange example of this, but I can't help but think of our old friend Richard Dawkins when I think about this point that Pascal is making. Because if you read Richard Dawkins very much, you'll see that this is a guy that doesn't, his exposure to Orthodox Christianity, for all the stuff he may have read, his exposure to Orthodox Christianity is very simplistic and crude. It strikes me as the kind of knowledge that someone has, at about maybe the 4th or 5th grade of Sunday school or something like that. And the problem there is that what's really at issue is that there are, or even in like the example that the speaker before me gave about the young man who was an atheist. Why? Well, because it had to do with concerns about evil and suffering and the death of his grandfather. Offering another argument in that context isn't going to help. Offering community with fellow believers is something that can help. And that's really the way that Pascal is thinking of the wager. The wager is part of this total project, this total argument. And we might think of it as attempting to make religion lovable by showing, as Pascal says, that one should wish that it were true, even if one doesn't fully understand or certainly feel that it is true, right? We often use the word, this annoys me as a teacher in a philosophy class, when students use the word feel when they mean think, right? But it's also fair, in defense of my students, I have to acknowledge and recognize, as Pascal would point out, that in us, as the dual beings that we are, feeling and thinking are inextricably intertwined. And so sometimes our thinking is shaped by our feeling, and what we often have to do is reshape our thinking and even make choices about ways to resituate ourselves so that our feelings can be altered in response to that. What is the ultimate end of human beings? Well, according to Pascal, it's not knowledge, but redemption, to put it in theological terms, or seeing the self in the proper way at the proper level, to go back to those existential terms that I was talking about earlier. As he says, faith is different from proof. One is human, the other is a gift of God. It is this faith which God places in man's heart, and the proof is often the instrument. But this faith is in the heart and obliged to say, not skio, I know, but credo, I believe. And so what Pascal means by this is that knowledge is instrumentally valuable for resolving the crisis of the human condition, but it is not the telos or end of the human condition. To put it another way, Pascal wants, as a result of the apologetic process of the pensées, not to make us philosophers, but to make us believers. That's the objective. So what about this idea of the heart as the organ of knowing? I've mentioned already the famous quote, "The heart has its reasons, which reason does not know." The apologist has to recognize and make use of the intuitive power of the heart to know. As Pascal says, we know the heart not only by means of the reason, but also by means, we know the truth, not only by means of the reason, but also by means of the heart. It is through the heart that we know the first principles, and reason, which has no part in this knowledge, vainly tries to contest them. Or, the way of God, who disposes all things gently, is to implant religion into our mind through reason and into our heart through grace. So as we can see, Pascal thinks that it's a complex, multi-fronted process where, of course, God is at work through the power of the Holy Spirit, infusing grace, even as the apologist is offering argumentation that speaks to the reason of the unbeliever. Pascal's point seems to be that the heart or intuition is the means for human self-transcendence, for reflecting on our condition and its wretchedness, and is ultimately the pathway for redemption from it. Now, he has a strange series of passages in the Pensées about an idea he calls the machine. The intuitive power of the heart to know is related to this idea of the machine. And by that he seems to mean the automatic response of the passions to how we habituate ourselves given our circumstances. In fact, we might think about the machine in terms of mechanical human behavioral responses to given situations. Only what Pascal wants to point out is, unlike a mechanical deterministic behaviorist, he wants to point out that choices that we make by using our reason enable us to put ourselves into situations that will alter the mechanical effects of the passions on us. And this is related to the wager in the comments that I've made earlier. The person who understands that belief in God is reasonable may therefore cultivate the felt belief in the truth of Christianity by, as he says, behaving just as if they believed. That will make you believe quite naturally and according to your animal reactions. Pascal thus acknowledges that passions can impede us from faith in God, but they can also be enlisted in the apologetic project. Now, I want to say something briefly about Pascal's attention to multiple religious traditions and how the apologetic project that he's engaged in addresses religious pluralism. Quite simply, Pascal argues that there are three kinds of religion. Religions that feed human pride by emphasizing human divinity or greatness or transcendence. Secondly, religions that emphasize human sinfulness or wretchedness, often while at the same time making demands for human moral goodness or even perfection. And then Christianity, which he sees as sui generis, which affirms both human sinfulness and human greatness. Christianity, and there's some comments on the notes about how to apply this directly. I think Pascal, as I said, his knowledge of what we would call comparative religions or world religions was limited, but I think this analysis shows us that he had keen insight into understanding key differences between Christianity and other religious traditions. Christianity affirms human wretchedness and greatness in its fundamental theology and anthropology by acknowledging that we have divine origin, greatness, dignity, rational transcendence, having been created in the image of God. Think Genesis chapter 1. Our human greatness is damaged by sin. And third, God has made provision by grace to remediate the damaged condition of human beings. If you think about this, of course, these 3 points are the gospel spelled out. Of the 3 religious types, Christianity alone resonates with the human condition as we experience. This is that anthropological or existential apologetic. Christianity alone resonates with the human condition as we experience it, including both elements of human transcendence and glory and human wretchedness. Other religions either feed human pride by emphasizing transcendent human dignity without fully acknowledging our wretchedness. And I think here of God is in you, New Age religions, even primitive animisms and so forth. Or, by contrast, they promote despair by emphasizing human wretchedness without providing hope for redemption apart from human efforts. And I think here Pascal's, probably the idea that he had in mind was a legalistic Judaism, but we can imagine similar examples. If I'm politically incorrect, I might say that Islam might be grouped in this category. The shortcomings of non-Christian religions are replicated in non-religious philosophical outlooks as well. So Pascal believes that the kinds of approaches to human transcendence and dignity and human wretchedness are replicated in different philosophical outlooks as well. Outlooks that represent or emphasize human transcendence on the one hand, outlooks that emphasize human limitations or wretchedness on the other hand. What this means at the bottom line is that Pascal argues that Christian theology and anthropology resonate with our own experience of the human condition. That entire account that I've sketched out already about our disproportion, our duality, our finding ourselves mysterious as we reflect on ourselves. Christianity then proposes a solution to the fundamental human problem in the form of redemption by divine grace. It offers the answer to the existential crisis of the human condition, which is to know our place or level. Of course, the answer to this then to Pascal is our place or level is that we are like God in having been created in the divine image, but we have impaired, marred, stained that divine image by our willing choice to engage in sinful activity, and that only intervention by God can restore us to that place of transcendence and glory. I went backwards. Our human fragility and duality point to Christ, for thinking reeds are fragile fragments of beauty in the cosmos that are nurtured by the suffering servant. And you probably were thinking this when I read the thinking reed comment earlier in my presentation. But I think it's beyond doubt that Pascal was thinking about the famous passage from Isaiah when he says that human beings are thinking reeds. Speaking of the suffering servant, Isaiah says, "A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out." We are thinking reeds, and what the suffering servant does is take us in, embrace us in our fragility, in our weakness, in our brokenness, in our being damaged, and he draws us and raises us through repentance to glory. Jesus Christ therefore meets the human condition, because knowing God or presuming to find God without acknowledging our wretchedness leads to pride, as I said. Wallowing in wretchedness with no hope of knowing God leads to despair, or wallowing or being aware of our wretchedness while being called to moral perfection leads to the worst sort of wretchedness. But in Jesus Christ we find both God and our wretchedness. So what do we gain from attention to Pascal's pensées? As I said, I hope one way of thinking of my objective in this talk is to send you to the pensées. It's a book worthy of working through. It's a mess. It's fragmented notes, as I said, right? Imagine a book of Post-it notes tied together with thread. There you go. That's the pensées. There are long passages. Some are so short. I was just looking at it on the way in this morning before the conference began, And some of them are just completely enigmatic. What was Pascal thinking? Example, he has 4 lackeys. Yes, what's the point of that? That's one of the Pensée fragments. And it's by itself. It was on a little notepad, and the collector thought, I have no idea what relevance that is, but it's in there, so I have to put it in. But I hope you'll take a look. Yes, it's a difficult book to work through, but there are powerful tools there. So what are some of the resources that we gain from attending to this book? I think Pascal's approach gives us tools beyond standard classical apologetics, especially insofar as it reminds us of the human condition, the condition of people that are going to be the recipients of our apologetic efforts. And as I also said, it gives us some information, I think, some solid reflective information about the psychology of conversion. Secondly, it offers a powerful critique of modern culture. For example, its focus on diversion or entertainment. And it speaks to and informs assumptions and artifacts in popular culture. I've already mentioned the TV series Lost, but I might also just point out the fascination with skepticism that we find popping up in movie after movie after movie about virtual reality scenarios. It's something that Pascal, even though he was writing 400 years ago, it's the sort of thing he was thinking about. We think about our place in the world. We think about how do I understand myself and my embodiment in the world. And we begin to think, is this really the world? Is the world as I think it is? That sort of skepticism that really is characteristic of modernity and even modern popular culture is something Pascal is very aware of. It addresses and engages the existentialist tendencies of contemporary culture, both popular and intellectual. We do live in a post-existentialist culture. Indeed, I direct an organization on the Gonzaga campus called the Gonzaga Socratic Club. It's modeled after the Oxford Socratic Club that was presided over by C.S. Lewis in the mid-1900s. And the reason I started the Gonzaga, I didn't start the Oxford Socratic Club. The reason I started the Gonzaga Socratic Club was my sense that in encountering and talking to students, student after student after student, held a position that I might call something like roughly emotive existentialism, where they thought that, well, reality is what you make it, and it all has to do with your emotions. And Pascal's apologetics speaks to this stance that we often find in people in our world. Pascal's apologetic also acknowledges the complexity of human nature without falling into mushy relativism. In other words, he wants to say, yes, that we have this complex dual nature as beasts and angels, as human beings created by God with dignity given to us by our divine creation, but that creation is marred by our sinfulness. It engages, as I've at least tried to hint here toward the end of the talk, it engages the modern problem of religious pluralism, which is often a critical issue for people with skeptical doubts about Christianity. And finally, it highlights the centrality of Christ for human redemption and self-understanding. Pascal reminds us, I mean, this is kind of interesting for a person who's read by philosophers, who's read by people who are interested in cultural artifacts, again, like Lost. But if you read the pages of the Pensées, you'll be surprised to find how central the place Pascal gives to Christ is. He's very clear that all of these things I've talked about, the human condition, our dual nature, our perplexity about the mysterious of human existence, all of it points to Christ. And that's his objective. And indeed, I can't think of a better objective for a Christian apologist. Thank you. Fire away.
can you recommend any resources on the psychology of conversion that would be helpful to us in like crafting our approaches? Or could you recommend any books on pensées that kind of makes more sense out of it rather than having to wade through it completely on your own?
That's a good question, and I should have prepared better. On thinking about Pascal, Doug Rutais, who's a frequent speaker here at the conference, has a nice little book on Pascal. And there's another one, now I'm suddenly blanking out the author's name, Making Sense of It All, I'm sorry? Tom Morris, very good, thank you. That's a very accessible read-through of the arguments of the pensées. I appreciate that you asked me about the psychology of conversion. I've just started teaching at Gonzaga a course on conversion and personal transformation. Again, I'm tempted to chase a rabbit here. Gonzaga is a Jesuit Catholic university. I'm a Southern Baptist interloper on a Jesuit Catholic university campus, but they let me do my thing there. And we've recently altered our core curriculum in ways that, if you ask me, it's moving in a more secular direction. But one of the things that we've done is introduce a new first-year seminar course. And we're allowed to pick, there's supposed to be various topics to help introduce students to university life and to the core curriculum at Gonzaga. And so, being the subversive that I am, I'm teaching a first-year seminar on conversion and personal transformation. And you know what? I didn't even know this until just a couple of years ago, but there's a significant literature on primarily in the sociology of religion on conversion. And a favorite author of mine is Rodney Stark, who's affiliated with Baylor University, has written a series of books. But he has a set of articles on conversion. And an easy place to find some of this is to look at his book, The Triumph of Christianity, because he summarizes some of his own research and includes references in the footnotes. So he's a good person. Now I'm going to forget the guy's first name, but a guy named Rambo, no, not Sylvester Stallone, has also written a book on the sociology of conversion, and that's a good resource as well. One of the things, thank you for asking the question, that really does help me say something about this recent literature in the sociology of religion. I think it's very important, and I think I'm like most Christians in not having known anything about this literature until just a couple of years ago. What they often point out is Rodney Stark began his scholarly work as I think he was raised as a Christian. He's one of those people that you can't find out much autobiographical or biographical information about. He was raised a Christian, and I think kind of drifted away from it, especially as he was trained as an academic. But it was doing some of this research that helped push him back in the direction of Christianity. And if you know the series of books he's been pumping out from Baylor, he has a lot to say about, especially the sociological dimensions of how Christianity and sociological and cultural place of Christianity, especially in the West. But one of the things that he was instrumental in arguing early on in his scholarly work was the importance of groups and group identity in conversion. And he and a colleague started by researching a small, little-known group called the Moonies, when they were small and little known. And what he found is that they used primarily social relationships as the foundation for their evangelism. And another place this pops up in Stark is his argument that in the early church, this is a really controversial argument, but I think you guys can handle this. His argument is that when we look at the map of Europe and we see the depth that Christianity penetrated in Southern Europe versus Northern Europe, the difference, he says, is that in its first 2 centuries, Christianity largely spread by lay conversion, actually by family conversion. People said, my life has been changed, and they told their aunts and uncles and cousins, and they became converted. And what happened after Constantine and the designation of Christianity as the official state religion of the Roman Empire was that evangelism was handed over to the professionals, and what that meant was that they evangelized elites. And that means that in Scandinavia, Christianity is wide, but it's an inch deep. And the fascinating thing, now I'm forgetting, I think this is in Triumph of Christianity, he has a map that shows how Christianity expanded northward, and you can see the line where deep conversion took place and shallow conversion took place. And if you know the moves of Scandinavian churches, for example, established churches away from Orthodox Christianity, you probably can see exactly what Stark is talking about here. So thanks for that question. Very good one.
My question is about resources too. It jumped out at me when you were going over religion type number 1 of how great we are. Just modern charismaticism in America, from Joyce Meyer to T.G. Jakes.
Right.
But I don't know if I can get those people to read Pensies. What is a 4th or 5th grade level Sunday school apologetic against that from a Pascal, of one?
Yeah. Well, an argument I'm going to make later this afternoon that Ryan's already referred to is if he weren't such an obscure filmmaker, you might have them watch the films of Terrence Malick, for example, The Tree of Life. I'm sorry? They do like Brad Pitt.
Yeah, so everybody likes him.
Right, so that might be a point of entry. I think actually another way that we can apply what Pascal is up to is that this is an apologetic that speaks to us in those moments, again, like Dr. Braxton talked about, when suffering and difficulty strike our lives. Right, that we often have this idea, I'm the master of the universe, everything is subject to me and my power and my will and my choices, until we hit the wall and the world doesn't follow what I want it to do. And at that moment, I think we should read Pascal. I'm not saying that I should make an unbeliever read Pascal, because I think you're right. They're going to say, well, I can't make heads or tails of this. But what we can do is be super sensitive to the fact that we are characterized as human beings by that dichotomy of angelism and bestialism, that we want to think of some of us want to think of ourselves as angels all the time, but that's a denial of our nature, and I think our nature catches up with us in one way or another. A fly buzzes around the room, or I find out I have cancer, or my best friend dies, or I lose all my money because I made a bad bet in the stock market, right? All of those things are exactly the sorts of things that we know we're all subject to. And Pascal speaks to that. And I think we as apologists should be prepared to say, suffering is terrible, and I want to sit with you and be your friend in suffering. And we might want to think about what understanding, what worldview, what understanding of ourselves and of the world fits best with this realization that you've come to have about the messiness of human existence. If you're not the master of the universe, how do you understand what you are then? And I think Pascal would say that's a moment equivalent to waking up on the desert island and looking around and saying, I used to be like those people who are thoroughly absorbed with shiny things. I was a person absorbed with shiny things, right? This person who's a master of the universe, and they realize, wait, now I'm in a place where I see that, okay, maybe I am still attracted to shiny things, but their allure for me has changed now because I'm different. And that's a place where a Pascal type apologetic can speak.
This will be the last question. Hi, I really enjoyed your lecture. I am finishing up my undergrad degree, and I'm having to read a lot of Kierkegaard. And a lot of the stuff that you're speaking of with Pascal is is in Kierkegaard's writing, like materialism, heart versus reason, particularly psychological elements in the conversion factor. How much would you say, since I've never really read Pascal, how much would you say Kierkegaard was influenced by Pascal, or was he?
I appreciate this question a lot too. I'm a huge fan of Kierkegaard. And I mentioned that I don't think Pascal is a fideist. I don't think Kierkegaard's a fideist either, even though lots of critics, including Christian critics, think that Kierkegaard is a fideist. But I think you're right, that there are a lot of themes that you find in Pascal that are present in Kierkegaard as well. I've actually tried to explore this question, and I'm not sure that we can know very much about Pascal's influence, if at all, on Kierkegaard. That's something that I guess I have to, now using our modern digital tools, I'm going to have to do a search that just looks for the word Pascal and sees how many times I can find it in the journals, for example, in Kierkegaard's journals. I will say this, that it's very insightful of you to notice the connection, and I think the text of Kierkegaard in which we find these themes most clearly addressed is in The Sickness Unto Death, where notice what the book is. It's a Christian anthropology. That's what Kierkegaard is doing in The Sickness Unto Death. And again, he's talking about this dual nature that we have of infinite and finite. Really what he's getting at is our transcending nature and our limiting nature. And it's the same as what Pascal is talking about our angelic dimension and our bestial dimension. And of course, just like Pascal wants to say we are both and we can't try to pick one or the other, Kierkegaard wants to argue, and this is the central claim of The Sickness Unto Death, he wants to claim that our attempts to define ourselves by one or the other inevitably produce despair. And what we have to do is, as he says in that book, we have to rest transparently in the power that posited us, namely God. We have to understand ourselves as created beings that have a nature that is given to us by another, and we have to understand what that nature is, and we have to address it square on and face the task of living that nature that God has given us. I'm not sure on the historical point. I'm just not sure. But you're onto something here, and I don't know. Maybe that's a great thesis to write about parallels between Pascal and Kierkegaard.
I'll send you a copy if I do it.
All right, great.
All right, well, let's give Dr.